My name is Casey Beck. I am a grant program coordinator here at the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission. And we are joined by many committee members today in person at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife building. I wanted to provide a quick reminder before we go and hop into this thing that it is a public meeting. This will be recorded, and please, if you are not actively speaking, we ask that you keep your microphones on mute so we can eliminate background noise. Can everyone hear and see the room okay right now? Awesome. Thank you very much for the confirmation. On tap for today is reviewing an agreement amendment request and then discussing some very exciting developments for impacts that came out of the most recent legislative session. A tentative look at our anticipated meeting schedule. It is a long one today. We're running until about 3 p.m. These are all pretty generous estimates for exactly, how long we'll be discussing each item. And please note that we will be squeezing in at least one 10-minute break throughout this meeting. So everyone has a chance to, go freshen up and grab some more water. And let's see, before we take roll, I wanted to welcome a few of our newest committee members. I believe we might have someone joining us online. Okay, fantastic. Well, first we'll start in person. So welcome to the GRC, Paul Solomon. And we have online Michelle Mason. And I believe Carl McPherson, who is also a new GRC member, is not able to join us today. But if you don't mind, Paul, would you say just a quick introduction and to your fellow committee members?
Yeah, welcome. Thanks for having me. Paul Solomon, I'm the chair of the Criminal Justice Commission. I, for the past 23 years, ran sponsors a reentry program in Lane County. Recently retired or transitioned out of that role. Been involved in policy issues related to public safety for over 20 years. Been on lots of boards and commissions and committees related to public safety. And pleased to be here in my CJC role.
Thanks, Paul. Mm-hmm. Michelle Mason, we see that you joined online. Are you able to unmute and also offer an introduction?
Yes. Hi, Michelle Mason. Very happy to be a part of this. I've been working with justice involved people for about 6 years and just always eager to find new ways to help out locally and in our whole state.
Thanks so much, Michelle, and welcome you both to the Impacts GRC. We're now going to pause, take a quick roll. I can visually see we have a lot of faces here, but just for the record, please state if you are present.
Casey, when we call roll, if everybody could just give the briefest of introductions, maybe who they're affiliated with, what their position is for our new folks. That way they can get to know the folks in the room and online too.
Sure thing. So folks online, hope you heard that. As I call your name, if you would just take a quick moment to introduce yourself, your role, and yeah, we will go through it that way. So first on my list is Sam Byers.
Hello, everyone. Sam Byers, Adult Behavioral Health Director with OHA and co-chair with Ken. Nice to be here.
Thanks, Sam. Ken Sanchagrin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Ken Sanchagrin, the Executive Director of the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission and co-chair with Sam. It's good to see everybody today for the first time since before COVID, at least the ones who are in the room.
Thanks, Ken. Judge Shanti.
Hi, I'm Senior Judge Shanti. I'm retired in 2021, but still working some as a senior judge. And I've been on the Impacts Grants Committee since the beginning. And there's some of us that have seen this through for so long, and it's nice to see everyone here, and it's really grand to see it continuing.
Thank you, Judge Shanti. Jeremiah Stromberg.
Jeremiah Stromberg, I'm the Assistant Director of Community Corrections at the Department of Corrections and have been on the Impacts Committee since its inception as well.
Thanks, Jeremiah. Liz Weber.
Liz Weber, I'm the Assistant Director of the Housing Stabilization Division at Oregon Housing and Community Services.
Thanks, Liz. Steve Gunnels.
Hi, Steve Gunnels. I'm the district attorney in Deschutes County.
Eric Swallow.
Hi, I'm Eric Swallow, Director, Umpqua Valley Public Defenders in Douglas County. I've also been on the Impacts Committee since its inception, and I'm excited to continuing this work.
Thanks, Eric. Chief Marsha Harden. Commissioner Hall. Barry,
Wait a minute,
you're
I
on-
think it would help if I unmuted. Claire Hall, Lincoln County Commissioner, been a member since the beginning.
Thanks, Claire. Alicia Beamer.
Alicia Beamer, I've been here since the beginning too, and I'm representing hospitals, so with Peace Health.
Stacy Brubaker.
Stacy Brubaker, I'm the Department Director for Jackson County Health and Human Services. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker, and I am on this committee representing the Oregon Association of Community Mental Health Programs, and I too have been here since the beginning.
Thank you, Stacy. Dr. Brigham.
I'm Greg Brigham, CEO, Adapt Integrated Healthcare, also a member from the beginning.
Sheriff Landers.
Hi, Curtis Landers, Lincoln County Sheriff, and also I'll be representing the Oregon State Sheriff's Association, and I've been here since the beginning also.
Stanfield.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sharon Stanfield. I'm the Chief Health Officer of Governmental Affairs for the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians down in Roseburg, and I represent the 9 federally recognized tribes here in Oregon.
Senator Gelston was not able to make it. Is that correct? Okay. Janie Gullickson.
Represent the peer workforce, peer services, and people with lived experience, and I should be there in about 10 minutes. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Janie. RJ Navarro.
Ramiro Navarro Jr., most people call me RJ for short. I'm a peer support specialist at Project Able. I'm a veteran, somebody who has lived experience with the criminal justice system, addiction, and mental health.
Thanks so much. Michelle Mason, I know you already shared your introduction, but if you don't mind just saying present for the record.
Present.
Thank you much. Representative Bauman's not making it. Okay. And then Chair Solomon, same thing, or excuse me, not Chair Solomon in this context, sorry. Boss Solomon.
Yeah, present. And I should also mention that I was here at the beginning. I was on the original committee that was chaired by Pat Allen and Sheriff Myers when this work started. So I've been tracking impacts for a while.
Thank you, Paul. And then Carl McPherson also not able to attend. So just want to confirm for the record that we indeed have quorum and then some. All right, so our first order of business today is going to be reviewing an agreement amendment request from the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. Because we have some new faces here and also because it's been a while since we've met in person or online, wanted to do a quick overview of the amendment review and approval process. So approval from this grant review committee is required when an amendment request from a grantee exceeds 10% of that program's total grant award and or makes any substantive change to their programmatic implementation. Grant staff, the folks on this side of the table, we are able to kind of administratively approve any other amendment requests if they don't reach those thresholds. So today, specifically for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, we are exceeding that 10% threshold. Nothing's really changing programmatically, but because it exceeds that, that's why it's brought to you today for review and approval. And also, as you probably just listened through, there are so many of us present. So we use a voice voting process. I will articulate the matter that is up for vote. There's no need for formal motions. We will have a pause for anyone who wishes to abstain to make that clear for the record. And then we will take a round of ayes and then take a round of nays. So just if there's any questions on that from GRC members, let me know. Otherwise, we are going to proceed with review. So the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, as part of their Q6 amendment request, so that was at the beginning of this year, are requesting to reallocate about $245,000 to personnel from contractual services. More or less, this reallocation of funds come from an amazing development where they're moving all these services in-house and they no longer need to contract with external providers. They, not so recently, but fairly recently opened up the great, oh gosh, I forget the name of it right now off the top of my head, but I think it's Great Circle Recovery. And so they are utilizing a lot of the providers there, and really the only new addition, which you'll see here, that third bullet, is a behavioral health administrator, 0.25 FTE, to just kind of help manage this change and the new in-house staff. So the existing SUD therapist 1, existing SUD therapist 2 are the positions that are being fully moved in-house. And yeah, the total request is $245,103.07. Are there any questions from grant review committee members as to, why the change, or if anything's unclear on the slide? Yeah, Paul.
So I'm curious about, it says previously contracted transitional house services. So are those being provided in-house as well?
They are.
Where?
Yeah, it's a really exciting move for these folks. Yeah, Dr. Brigham.
So I'm just wondering where Medicaid fees might fit in if these are, looks like they are therapists and I know that they're probably credentialed to bill and probably some of these are, some of the members may have coverage anyway. I'm just curious where that fits.
Yeah, that's a great question. To the best of my knowledge, there is work that they do seek Medicaid care for. However, some of the specific duties of the therapists, these two here are specifically for Impact's clients. And I believe that these positions do not seek Medicaid or Medicare coverage. Yeah, Alicia?
Part of it, though, I think is their sustainability plan, right? They're starting
Yeah,
up
I'm
these
not sure.
positions and then starting to build later to sustain, was how I interpreted that.
Well, it may be that they're providing services that are not billable
Right,
as well.
and that, right.
As far as curious.
Yeah, I don't remember, and I'm not seeing that they had anything specific to that question in their agreement amendment request. But I'm also happy to get back to you, Dr. Brigham. I can reach out to those folks if that's something that you'd like or curious about.
I don't think it has to derail the decision-making process, but maybe making a note that that needs to be accounted for either through the clarification that there are no billable services provided, or if there are, how that revenue is accounted for going forward.
Will do. Any other questions or concerns, comments? Welcome, Jamie. All right. We're going to take a quick pause then for public comment. Should there be anyone on this call, please feel free to use the raise hand feature or just unmute yourselves. If you're joining us via teleconference, you can kind of say something so we can hear you, but this is now the time for public comment. Should you wish to weigh in on the decision for approving Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde's agreement amendment request? Right. I'm not seeing any hands. And no one's popped off mute. So we will go ahead and move forward with discussion and action. Is there any further discussion from members of this committee? Yes, Judge Shanti.
Well, first I want to say that this is pretty exciting change in their program, bringing it in-house. To me, seems like the ideal thing to do with a lot of these programs, because then you don't have all the problems with changing providers outside and more control and all of that. So I'm in favor of this entirely, but to jump off on the two comments that were made before, and this is maybe more overall all programming. I can't remember we had a certain amount of money that would go to staff to try to help people do things like make sure that they were getting as much Medicare coverage as they could, and also keeping in mind how to get it sustainable without the impact grant money, because we didn't know how long the impact grant money was going to last. Are we doing anything like that? Or did we ever get that? Did we ever set aside that money? I'm sorry, I just can't remember.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Judge Shanti. Let me see, a specific amount of funding going towards positions, for the purposes of looking into sustainability practices. I must have preceded my time on this grant. However, sustainability practices are definitely something that we ask about when the request for grant proposals come about. It's one of the things that we hope all applicants and existing grantees continue to think about it. I know that several folks at this table have had conversations with grantees about their sustainability plans and plans for sustained funding in the future, different funding sources, et cetera. But I'm not familiar with any specific funding towards positions. Can you?
Doesn't ring a bell for me either, but I do think that maybe one of the operative questions too is what their timeline is for this. When you look at the breakdown for the therapists, two therapists, it's not a lot of money. And so it may be that it's a partial position with some billing back, like Dr. Brigham and Alicia brought up, or maybe it's just from the timeline. But I think if they're on a short timeline, then it's something we could ask them moving forward, what their sustainability plan is, and be a little bit more specific for.
Yeah. And just to chime in, maybe I'm not, I guess I should, I'm conjuring up my memory a little better, and maybe people that have been here for a long time will remember better, but we talked about some of the small counties or tribes don't have the resources to do like grant writing and things like that. It's just impossible for them. And we talked about maybe someone from staff or using some of that money to kind of help facilitate or look at whether we can help facilitate or support them in their grant writing or their things like that they just don't have a dedicated person for, and they don't have anyone that's experienced in doing it. But I don't know if we ever got off the ground on that idea or what, but that would be just when we're talking about this particular one. That would be something to, know if they needed some help figuring out how to do that. And then if we had someone that could help with that.
Yeah, thank you, Judge Shanti. Those are great comments. It is something within the administrative budget bucket that those are allowed for expenses, some staff time to, look at sustainability or other endeavors. So there's currently a 10% cap on that for all county grantees. And then it kind of depends on the indirect cost rate that's federally negotiated with tribes on what their admin buckets are. But that might be a good resource to tap into is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, thank you for those comments, Judge Shanti. Anything further?
I wanted to comment that, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
I've been here. As I recall, that was a component in the original applications and also in the scoring matrix that we used.
Yes.
I don't have any specific recollection that we built that into all of them.
Yeah, we did. There wasn't necessarily a scoring component for it, but the program sustainability narratives are part of the RFGP to this day. And the most recent one, should there be iterations of even a short form application in the future, I think that's worth bringing up as a narrative question to continue to inquire with programs about their plans, but also to maybe find out if there's opportunities for technical assistance on CJC end or otherwise that, we could be helping them out in a way of grant writing. Might also be something we're thinking about, should impacts have $100 million someday, which would be amazing. But for folks who are not currently seated at the table in terms of grantees, maybe counties and tribes who have not yet been able to explore impacts programming, what it would be like to kind of have some sort of upfront planning money and technical assistance in grant writing before even applying for impacts. Sam Byers, thanks for raising your hand.
Sure. I think that I just wanted to say, it makes sense to ask for kind of the full FTE to start if the positions are coming in place. And if, those particular positions, it is true, they would qualify depending on the work they're doing for Medicaid billing. And our Medicaid teams are actually there to support providers to understand that. So I think as we go back and talk to this grantee, if that is something that they're seeking, that's something we could facilitate too. They may already know that and sort of be needing to build up sort of the number of people they're working with in order to offset the cost of the FTE a little bit with Medicaid funds. But if there were any questions there, definitely the Medicaid team is responsible for supporting providers that way.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, RJ.
Maybe I misunderstood too, because in the beginning, I felt like there was a technical assistance, portion of funds that was directed towards helping organizations set up the infrastructure that they needed to be successful in administering their programs. And so it sounds like that Medicaid billing isn't incorporated into that. Is that accurate?
Gosh, to the best of my knowledge, there are no grantees receiving technical assistance specific funding at this time. So that may have been something that preceded my time with impacts. So pre-2021, to the best of my knowledge. That I
ask about the Waddell. I don't think the Waddell group is providing that. I mean, there is technical assistance to the grantees being provided. It's more on the data collection and other, I think, program administration standpoints, but I don't think we've touched on the split Medicaid versus non-billable items.
Yeah.
But I think that's something we could talk to the Waddell group about as they continue to provide that TA for the grantees.
And for what it's worth, that is not coming out of grantees budgets whatsoever. So that TA is provided separately.
Approved separately.
Yeah.
Just you.
Even having the ability to do like a warm handoff and say, well, this is the provider or this is the CCO in your area. This is who you talk to be able to initiate that billing, I think would be really supportive to organizations that are trying to continue this work after, impacts funds.
Definitely. And I think that's one of the greatest benefits of, administering this grant in consultation with Oregon Health Authority, like Sam Byers on this call as co-chair. We have some excellent resources to tap into for such warm handoffs such as that. Yeah, Dr. Brigham.
Comments. So the conversation's helpful in clarifying my thinking. I think our charge is to make sure any services being provided that would be Medicaid eligible, they are being identified and we are pursuing that funding for them. So we're not using impacts grant funding to pay for anything that Medicaid could be paying for. And since we have a diverse range of grantees, it's probably worth us looking at the program from that perspective to see if anyone might be providing services. It could be Medicaid eligible, but if they're not aware of it, or they just don't have the infrastructure in place that we've been discussing, and then we can target support for them to figure that out. But I just been my understanding of our charge from the beginning that we need to make sure we're not supplanting.
Yeah, definitely. And I believe, you know, as part of the RFGP and application processes, it has been communicated to grantees that exact expectation. However, no, I guess, formal Medicaid audit has occurred quite yet. So we could, you know, figure out a way with capacity to work with grantees and use our amazing partners at OHA to identify some technical assistance opportunities. And I can even imagine just a couple of, you know, monthly office hours of swing on by and virtually or in person, what have you, to identify any Medicaid sticking points and kind of troubleshoot issues that way. If there are no further questions or comments, we can go ahead and proceed with the vote. So the decision before you now is whether or not you approve the agreement amendment request from the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde that was presented to you today. Here, I will proceed to ask for those who abstain, those in favor, and those opposed. So are there any abstentions from this group and the GRC members joining us online? Not hearing any. So those in favor, please unmute, or in present, please say aye.
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 Thank
Aye.
you. Those opposed, please say nay. All right, that passes. Thank you for your time and attention on that. And excellent questions. Okay, so as promised, we have some exciting updates to the world of impacts, which now feels like a world. It's expanding and growing in all shapes and sizes. So for those of you who are not aware, House Bill 4002 was signed into law yesterday by the governor on April 1st. And that is a very chunky bill. It has a lot going on. But part of it recriminalizes possession and delivery of controlled substances as a drug enforcement misdemeanor, and also comes with a lot of other new changes and new programs as they relate to the state's addiction crisis. One thing that it established was the Oregon Behavioral Health Deflection Program, which is kind of a mouthful. And here at the state, we do love acronyms. So you probably will hear me referring to it as the BHD program. But the Oregon Behavioral Health Deflection Program, administered by the Criminal Justice Commission under, you wonderful people, the Impacts Grant Review Committee. There will be grant funding available to Oregon's counties and federally recognized tribal governments to establish new deflection programs or continue implementing deflection programs that already exist, should they choose to do so. It is currently an optional opportunity. House Bill 5204, which was the accompanying funding bill to 4002, appropriated $20,708,200 to the BHD program and instructed the CJC to basically get a very specific early access timeline for 23 identified counties. And we will get into that business a little bit later, but there's a lot going on with these two bills. And right now, we're going to spend some time kind of giving you an overview of what this behavioral health deflection program is, the new responsibilities that this GRC will have. We'll talk a little bit about applicant eligibility. We'll get into an implementation plan, which will show some really cool timelines that hopefully you'll be really impressed with my PowerPoint skills. But yeah, lots of amazing facts that we'll be sharing with you all. But I just want to take a moment to say this is a lot of new information, And I welcome any questions and also come with a big grain of salt that we may not have answers quite yet. But we at least are familiar with the bills and the deflection program for the past couple of months, and I want to be mindful that it might be brand new news to some folks on this call today. So I'm going to try to come at it with plain language and clean, transparent understanding. But feel free to stop me at any point in time, especially if I get a little too excited and start rolling through. All right, so established by House Bill 4002 in this most recent legislative session, and under impacts, as I said, we have the new Oregon Behavioral Health Deflection Program, and this will be grants to Oregon's counties and federally recognized tribal governments to fund deflection programs. Here, as you can see on the screen, deflection program means a collaborative program between law enforcement agencies and behavioral health entities that assist individuals who may have substance use disorder, another behavioral health disorder, or co-occurring disorders to create community-based pathways to treatment, recovery support services, housing, case management, or other services. As I mentioned, a little over 20 million was appropriated to the BHD program by Section 15 of House Bill 5204. Some of the first things that GRC members might notice is this is not our normal high utilizer target population. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through this. This is not the same impacts target population of high utilizers that we're used to working with. This is a much broader population. However, some things might be ringing bells. Substance use disorder, behavioral health disorders, co-occurring disorders, as well as the services provided. There are so many ways of overlap for these programs. And I believe that is why the legislature intended to put this under the umbrella of existing impacts. In terms of your role and new responsibilities, first, one of the charges was 2 additional members to the GRC from the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission. So Paul Solomon here today represents one of those newly appointed members. He chairs the Criminal Justice Commission, and we will be joined by Carl McPherson. And they will bring this GRC to a total of 21 members instead of, nice clean sounding 19. All of your responsibilities that were established by Senate Bill 973 back in 2019 still stand. You're still in charge of the impacts program that has high utilizers. What House Bill 4002 does is build upon those responsibilities with this new program. So I've highlighted a couple new responsibilities here, new additional responsibilities. Ken?
I just cut in just very briefly, just to make sure it's clear. So what Casey is saying is correct, that we basically have 2 grant programs under a single umbrella now. However, when Casey mentions that we still have all of our old responsibilities, that is specific to our high utilizer group. The legislation specifically cuts out all of the other statutory responsibilities that we have under the old impacts for the new. And that was designed so that we can move very quickly on this initial round of funding, but then rulemaking and other approaches put more of a foundation in place as we go forward, in recognition that we're in crisis now, but then we could have a more mature program once we get some initial funding out the door. So any of the processes, requirements that you recall from old impacts, when we are talking about this deflection population, you will just have to shift that out of your mind for the time being, but hopefully not forget it so we can do old impacts too. I just want to make sure that that's clear, that it's kind of a clean slate. So just want to make that comment.
No, I appreciate that, Ken. Thank you. It definitely remains intact that you all are the decision makers. However, there is a list of applicable OARs that no longer apply for deflection specifically. And that may change in the future, but for the time being, when we are talking about timelines, especially today, I prepare you for whiplash, it's quick. But there are certain, I guess, policies and way that this impacts GRC has done work in the past that just may not apply in rule at this time for deflection. It's a lot of caveats.
It doesn't mean we can't get there. We just we're not going to be there for this first disbursement, at least.
Yep. Cool. Thanks, Ken. So first, developing a grant application process for the BHD program, determining a proportion of funds available to an applicant that is a federally recognized tribal government for the BHD program. You'll notice the county is not on here because it is decided in statute. Approve a formula funding table for the BHD program. We'll get into that in much more detail a little bit later. And then monitor the progress, of and evaluate program outcomes for applicants receiving these funds. In terms of who's eligible to apply for a BHD grant, you must be one of Oregon's 36 counties or 9 federally recognized tribal governments. You must coordinate the development and administration of the deflection program with all the partners listed in the bill. It's quite a list. It includes things like district attorneys, law enforcement agencies, community mental health programs, and a provider from a behavioral health resource network. And then like a list of optional partners as well that can be including people like first responder agencies other than law enforcement, community providers, treatment providers, community-based organizations, case management providers, recovery support services providers, local mental health authorities, tribal governments, peer supports organizations, courts or local government bodies, or any other individual or entity deemed necessary. Very broad. So the first bit, the DA, law enforcement agency, CMHP, and BURN, those are the required components. The required partners need to be on board. And then everyone else could be part of it or in consultation with to kind of get this rolling. This applicant must also have a coordinator. Coordinator's duties include managing grant program funds awarded under this grant, as well as tracking and reporting data required by us, the CJC, as the administrating body. They also will be kind of working in coordination with our evaluation partners at the Oregon Health and Science University, Portland State University, School of Public Health, the Waddell Group, as you may all know them, through technical assistance and getting into that data collection system and all that jazz. Is there anything else we want to say about coordinator?
Are we going to talk a little bit more in detail?
This is
in
probably
the implementation plan, or is this the one?
This is kind of it. So it might be worth noting that in the bills, the coordinator position is a separately funded position, not through that 20 million, but instead through the Oregon Health Authority. I believe it was 9.8 million that was set aside. And basically the idea, as I understand it, was they already have existing contracts with a lot of these behavioral health resource networks and CMHPs, and they would just beef up those existing contracts to include money for a coordinator position. However, Oregon Health Authority is still working on this. Sam, I don't know if you had any comment or if I'm on the right track, but feel free to jump in if you wanted to speak to the coordinator.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of, I think, confusion. I think everything you're saying is correct. And I think there's some confusion at the legislative level. So we're just trying to finalize what the language means and then how the money can go out based on our service elements. We only have language in our contracts related to jail diversion, which is different than deflection. So I think those are the administrative hiccups that we're working through right now.
So I've got a question about the grant coordinators. I know like with the specialty courts, OJD has managed those. I'm curious about, we're really trying to get this money out the door quickly. Is OHA on the same timeline to administer funding for the coordinators as impacts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, go
Oh,
ahead, Sam,
sorry, I was gonna say, we are. I think that we have heard information both ways, that the funding was just for jail diversion and not the coordinators, and that it was for jail diversion and coordinators. So we can amend contracts and get that out through our service element to the participating counties quickly. But I think that there has not been full clarity on that 9.8 million. But yeah, our charge is to get it out the door very quickly as well, the same way that we would be doing the impacts funding that's assigned. And we already have contracts, so we would amend it. We wouldn't have to go through a full contracting process.
Thanks, Sam. I think it's also worth pointing out that the 60-day timeline that you might be referring to, it's kind of a shorter track. We will get into details later, I promise. But that may not be, we may not have to have coordinators on board for that to roll out. So that won't hold us up in terms of coordination with OHA and those existing contracts to get that early funding out. The other one that you'll see, the standard BHD program with kind of a more normal, less whiplash timeline, should be having money out, I think, by the end of September. And that's a much more reasonable timeline that we think OHA could easily be on board with. Thank you again, Sam. In terms of application requirements, having met all that eligibility criteria that is outlined in the bill, and of course will be in the request for grant proposals, also ask for a description of the following items. Description of that coordination with those program partners identified, a description of who is eligible for this deflection program. That will definitely help us in terms of looking at population and in data and research and evaluation of who falls under this deflection work. What constitutes a successful outcome. While this is very important to learn from local deflection programs, we also, you'll see in a little bit, are charged with our own set of outcome evaluation and metrics that we will be tracking. But it's always a great thing to know from a local program what their goals are with deflections, so that we can help kind of identify their progress. We want to know how the program is culturally and linguistically responsive, trauma-informed, and evidence-based. We'd love a description of the plan to address language access barriers for program referrals and procedures, and a description of how the program coordinator will communicate with all those program partners. So this RFGP and this application process, I'm imagining to look like a big action plan from folks who are going to be applying. Just kind of a very detailed, but also high-level brief. This is what we're doing. These are the folks that are on board. This is how we're communicating. These are the meetings we've got set up, and just like a detailed action plan is what I'm kind of anticipating. Oh, sorry.
So, and I'm sorry, I had to step out, but the definition, the individuals that are eligible for the program, will it be as specific as what we had with the high utilizers of the ED and the jails and the 4 or more, or is it going to be really up to the applicant to describe?
Yeah, it'll be really up to the applicant to describe. And I think at a minimum, it would be someone, I don't have the language right in front of me, but someone who was going to be charged, do you remember that language? Like going to be charged, thought to be charged, suspected of charge.
Yeah, maybe we don't need to go into that specific detail. I mean, I think the overall intent of the program, the intent of several of the pieces of 4002 is to offer numerous off-ramps for folks under this new recriminalization approach. And deflection being very, very front end, we're thinking of folks probably with a standalone possession charge. They don't have accompanying charges. They may not have been seen many times by law enforcement. So they're going to be very different from our high utilizers, most likely. That being said, counties can try to set those calibers more broadly or more narrowly, if they'd like. And so I think that some may take folks with some accompanying charges, but not others. Or perhaps, you know, some of their folks who, if it is a standalone PCS and they're a little bit more of a frequent flyer, they may still be deemed to be eligible. I think it's going to be really important for us when we ask that question to provide some specificity for what we're looking for, not just to say who's your eligible population, because we may just get a very broad answer. But to the degree we can specify what we want, then we can figure, we can see, we're gonna have a variety. But I don't think we should expect to see the level of detail that we did for the high utilizers with the number of bookings or other types of things, at least not at the outset. I think it's also probably important to note that I would say a number of our counties are not going to be completely ready day one. I'm sure Casey was going to get to it, but one of the eligible expenses for this grant is for planning and during this initial phase. And so we may also see some counties giving us some, you know, the 2-minute elevator speech of where they hope to be, but then it may take them a little bit of time to actually get to where they're implementing a thing. And I think at that point, we also could provide feedback on their thoughts as well, especially in relation to other counties and what they're proposing. So I think that we have some flexibility that we didn't have for our high utilizer.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Janie.
And speaking of that, it makes me wonder about the impact to our impacts programs that are, you know, folks who have been booked 4 or more times in a year. So will that sort of end up skewing the outcomes for impacts programs? It looks like there's actually an increase rather than a decrease in our folks that impacts serve. So
at least in our early conversations with our data collection partners at OHSU, I mean, we're certainly very aware of that. And while I would hope that some counties can use their pre-existing high utilizer infrastructure, you know, for example, Deschutes County has a place to drop folks off. There's no reason why you couldn't drop off somebody with a standalone PCS. But I think that the nut we're gonna have to crack with the folks gathering the data and actually doing the intake is making sure we're triaging them correctly so that yes, we actually see who should receive what services, because certainly one group is going to have a different need on average compared to the other. So you're right, we don't want to just run them all together. But that's something we've had very, very basic conversations with OHSU so far, knowing that we need to build something that is slightly different. But we've not put the detail on it yet.
Yeah, RJ.
I'm curious as to if these application requirements are set in stone, or is this something that's negotiable? And the reason that I ask that is because when I look at how a program is culturally and linguistically responsive, I think of an organization that would provide a service only because there's funding there. And we're not supporting those culturally specific organizations that are providing that service regardless of what their funding's there, because that's the community they're I think even CJC did a report to the legislature during this process that identified that communities of color are going to be disproportionately impacted by the recriminalization of possession. So how can we incentivize culturally specific, linguistically specific organizations, community-based organizations that are working with their communities every day and being a part of this process?
The basic requirement that they discuss how the program is responsive, that's the statutory requirement. So they'll have to discuss it. But I think how they execute that is something that's more under our purview, right? And so whether they discuss it in an insufficient way so that we don't think that they're actually doing it, or whether maybe they're utilizing services that are not the best use of their funds. I mean, I think that's where we have a chance to weigh in. I think that for the first go around, we may have to see what counties come up with and maybe be a little bit more open to things. But then certainly if we get into a rulemaking process, for example, if we want to by rule say that, you know, our definition of something linguistically responsive is that it maximizes local resources in the community, you know, externally, then I think that's something we can discuss as a rule. I think it would be a little hard at this point, but I think too, when we get these initial applications, given the speed with which folks are putting it together, we're going to see it all being built in real time and probably be walking along with the counties as they do it. And so I think that we're going to learn a lot as we go through as well. I'm not saying that we'll learn anything that would change, the need for using community partners as opposed to maybe trying to build things in-house. But I think it'll be fascinating to see where that begins to go, and that should inform our decisions on rulemaking as we kind of move into that phase of this rollout. This is my opinion. I think that'll be a good place for us.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. So just to clarify, this is kind of set in stone for right now, but moving forward, we can look at that.
But again, they're discussion points in an application. I don't think that any of these are necessarily defined.
I would also say too, that these could be built upon, this might be a good starting point. But that doesn't mean that we could, evolve the questions to kind of dive a little deeper, meet this and then some. Sam, I see your hands up.
I think, and I'll just speak for myself, I think I'm still grappling with the definition of deflection and diversion. Like, I think I can get there, but where they start bumping up against each other is where I'm not clear. And then what is our sort of review to understand deflection in a meaningfully different way than diversion, other than sort of the legal pathway, right? Like, does a deflection program look different? Does it have more outreach? Is that the emphasis? Does it have less outreach? Is it the same? I think those are some of the things that in my mind I'm grappling with a little bit. And I agree, we'll be watching as our counties build this out and start thinking through it. But there is a space where I think deflection and diversion start rubbing up against each other. And I'm still not totally clear how that will play out.
Thanks for your comment, Sam. I don't know if I have a magic answer. I don't know if you have anything.
No magic answer needed, just
Yeah.
food for thought. Just food for thought.
It's definitely something that will be worth keeping in mind as we move forward and not only build this out, but see how it comes in. I do have a slide in the appendix here, that AOC slide. Would that be helpful to show right now, or?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that could be
okay.
helpful. So I think when I think of deflection versus diversion, it's more of the timing within intervening with an individual. And so that timeline might help, yeah.
So when we are talking about deflection, it's that top blue path, and I realize for folks in the room, this is going to look really tiny, and I'm sorry. What those words say on the screen are: deflection, law enforcement makes a direct referral for a connection with a treatment provider, and local buy-in. 23 counties representing 84 of Oregonians already participating. We'll get into that later. Those are those early identified counties that are ready to roll. And then the last blue bubble there says no charges filed, no criminal record, no public defender needed. This was from the Association of Oregon Counties. They have done a lot of work with Oregon's 36 counties, and kind of as this bill grew and changed, trying to keep their interested parties apprised of what the heck's going on. I liked the graphic because I thought it was interesting to see, how it differs when an arrest or citation for possession of controlled substance could go a couple different ways. I realize we have a couple more hands up, and I'm not sure who was first, but I see Stacy. So Stacy, do you want to go ahead and pop off mute?
But I just wanted to say, as we've started to grapple this here in Jackson County, we've pulled out our sequential intercept mapping that we did in 2019 to kind of see where we think, how far we've come and where we think this really falls. And we really have decided that it's really intercept 0 and 1, and just trying to figure out where between those two, between intercept 0 and intercept 1, it really fits. Whereas we think that diversion fits more in between, somewhere between intercept 1 and intercept 2, and almost more into intercept 2. So that, just for context, that's kind of how we've been trying to think about it, is pulling out our old sim mapping although we've moved the bar quite a bit, it still does make sense for us anyway here to be looking at this to help us guide the conversation. So I just want to throw that out.
No, yeah, thank you, Stacy. I really appreciate that. Now I wish I had a picture of a sim map in front of me, but yeah, looking at those sequential intercepts, that, yeah, 0 to 1 is like the farthest, you know, an earliest point of intervention. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Judge Shanti, I see your hand is raised.
Well, this is a really interesting discussion because when I looked at the map that you just had out in the discussion about the intercept 0, so it's a little problematic to me, just as maybe for some other people that are on the ground, which is the part that says no criminal record. So that would mean that I guess if you have a criminal record, you're not going to be one of the target people, because even though, so the police pick you up on a new crime.
Yeah.
And does that mean they can't refer you now on this new thing? Because there are people that have, you know, mucked around in the system and had maybe low level charges or something like that that could benefit from, now they're ready to be deflected as opposed to get a diversion, because it would be, I think, partly up to the DA whether the DA wanted to charge on that particular crime. And I'm thinking in particular like low-level misdemeanors, where you're starting to see clearly that if we don't do something, this is going to get worse. And it might be better to do the something, which is nothing, as long as they're getting treatment, if that makes any sense. It's kind of like civil commitment almost. You're not civilly committing someone, but you're trying to get them treatment before you get to that stage. But that doesn't mean that you've never had any contact with them before. There's never been ever any problem. So are we saying that if they have any criminal record, that the police can't refer them?
No, we are not. I'm so sorry if that was unclear, Judge Shanti. That no criminal records, not an eligibility requirement whatsoever. That would be a
good
hopeful outcome should someone successfully complete a deflection program.
All right, so they could get, you're just saying if they get deflected, then they won't have a criminal record for whatever it was they were picked up for in the first place.
Exactly.
They're never
Upon
charged.
successful completion. That's correct. So
Yes.
sorry that was unclear. Yeah.
No,
I knew that
it's
there'd be
my- it was
clear
my
bits of that
it was my
graphic.
problem. And so if we think of it that way, if that's not a criteria for eligibility, then really deflection is not significantly different than diversion, it seems to me, in terms of the practical. I mean, diversion is, of course, you get something and maybe you're in drug court or maybe you're doing a DA agreement or something, but it's still getting the people treatment.
Yeah. I would say that
right
understanding
up
is
front,
correct.
which is sometimes with diversion as well. You get it right up front.
Right. Yeah. I would say the only difference with deflection is that it could be even earlier and ideally, you know, would be pre-system involvement.
Right.
You know,
Like pre-drug court, for instance.
Yeah, like an interaction with an officer leads you right to treatment instead of further interacting with law enforcement, et cetera. So that's correct.
All right. Thank you.
Great. Shoot, it didn't load. In terms of eligible expenses, something that's unfortunately not on this list, but as Ken mentioned, planning grants are eligible expenses for this grant. And we'll get into that with this 60-day timeline. But grant funds may be used for deflection program expenses, behavioral health, workforce development, even capital construction of behavioral health treatment infrastructure. This differs quite a bit from some of the existing, I guess, work that could overlap with deflection. This, I would say, was probably one of the cooler selling points of using Impact's existing infrastructure and that kind of umbrella existing grant because impacts funding has this amazing flexibility. A lot of other things that already exist could be pretty rigid, including you know, some of the service elements for jail diversion that Sam was mentioning earlier. You know, they may not be able to help with that capital construction. So that's a big highlight here. In terms of those deflection program expenses, those could include a ton of things, but some examples would be law enforcement employees, deputy DAs, behavioral health treatment workers, peer navigators, mobile crisis and support services workers, et cetera. It's pretty large, but anyone kind of those partners doing this deflection work would be involved there. All right, so I would say now I was just hoping to kind of begin to share the two kind of separate tracks that are going to realign a little bit later. But we have early adopters and then the standard BHD program. For the early adopters, there were 23 counties identified in House Bill 5204. Just so everyone's on the same page in the room, I'm going to read through them once. So bear with me here. We've got Baker, Benton, Clackamas, Clatsop, Columbia, Crook, Curry, Deschutes, Gilliam, Grant, Harney, Hood River, Jackson, Josephine, Klamath, Lane, Malheur, Marion, Morrow, Multnomah, Umatilla, Wasco, and Washington. 23 identified counties in House Bill 5204 that are eligible to access 50% of their formula funding early as a planning grant. The governor signed House Bill 5204 yesterday, and that begins a 60-day clock, which is very fast in terms of grant processes. By that time that clock ends, 60 days from yesterday, so that's May 31st, the CJC needs to have money in hands to these 23 identified counties at the amount of 50% of their formula funding. I think it'll be a new record for us. Yeah, so I think we should all get plaques. But because of that, we're approaching this a little bit differently. This is going to be a planning grant. It's kind of inconceivable that with the governor signing the bill yesterday and us releasing an application next week, that these 23 counties will have super developed plans and all these partners on board. So we understand that. And instead, what this 50% funding is going to look like, let's say if the formula, someone was eligible for 100 grand, so they would get $50,000 upfront by May 31st to begin their planning process, to begin engaging with those partners in their communities, you know, having the robust discussions, getting buy-in, and maybe looking at their SIM mapping and really figuring out what deflection looks like for their community. So because of that, we're also moving forward with a short form application. This is basically going to be like a one-page, a front and back page document, very, very high level, concise. Who are you? Where can we send money? What are you thinking of doing in a couple of sentences? What's deflection look like for you? As accepting this 50% funding up front, you acknowledge that if you want the other 50%, you're going to have to go through a much, you know, bigger process as part of the standard folks, which I'll talk about in a minute. The project period would start April 1st, yesterday, and go through the end of this current biennium, which is June 30th of 2025. So just a little over a year. And that's for those early adopters only, the 23 folks identified 5204. And they would receive money by June of this year. So June 1st, they'd have money in hand, hopefully, that's the plan. And, you know, they could do all the eligible expenses. And it kind of goes with this understanding that it's a planning grant If they want to do something, actually operational, get something off the ground, they're going to have to go through that standard BHD, like full solicitation process, like everyone else. Also worth noting, of the 23 counties that said, yeah, I think we could get something going, we'd be interested in 50% early funding. It's very possible that maybe they aren't actually ready. So even though it'll be open to those 23 identified counties, it's possible that maybe we get 15 applications back for this early funding. That doesn't mean that the folks who chose not to aren't eligible for the standard track. Maybe they decide the standard track's better. Standard track doesn't really start that much later. So all that to say, there are two separate tracks here. The other one is the standard behavioral health deflection program, open to all of 36 counties, as well as Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribal governments. So it could be a planning grant. Maybe these folks, just needed even more time to plan. It also could be an operational grant. Like we have some folks in Oregon, I know Marion County comes to mind. They already have deflection work going. So maybe they will seek funding to build upon that. Lincoln County also comes to mind. It will be a more standard request for grant proposals solicitation process that members of this committee is accustomed to seeing, those applications that we review together, and we come together and make review and award decisions, et cetera. The early adopters, that short form application will be reviewed internally because it's going to be so scant. And they basically are just pressing a button, giving us information, and then we will process those funds. So the early adopters, you will not be reviewing at this time because they're just planning grants, whereas standard process, those will come back to you for review.
And just to insert too, it's not just that they're a planning grant. Statutorily in 5204, we are compelled to give them the funds. There's no option. And so that's the other reason why we're doing this more administratively. But I think the important thing to emphasize, which Casey's been mentioning, is that they still have to, it is, even though we are compelled to give them the money, it is still tied into section 76 of 4002, which means it's tied into the grant eligible expenses and other guardrails they put on. So we will be seeing what they're going to do when they submit in round 2 a budget. Right now, there will be no budget. They just get their funds. But to spend those funds, actually do things with them, we'll have to see what their plan is. So I don't want folks to be worried about this very fast turnaround for the initial money. I think it's just to get money in place so we can really hit the ground running, or so they can do some planning, but then we'll see the formal plans shortly after.
Casey?
Sorry.
How do you know how much funds you're going to give out to the early adopters if 23 out of 36 counties, for instance, have a very high budget? How will you be assured there'll be any funds left over for the standard? Because they're going to get 50% up front. They take up 18 million and they take 50% of it. How much is left for the other counties and the federally recognized tribes?
Thanks, Dr. Stanfield. Excellent question. May I introduce you to the beauty of formula funding?
So that was going to be my questions about the formula. Are you using like a grant and aid formula or a different formula?
Yeah, I will get into the formula funding, definitely maybe post break too. But basically, in the bill, we are also compelled. So we're compelled to get this money out, and we are compelled to do so via an existing formula that Oregon Health Authority's Oversight and Accountability Council used to fund the BERNS, the Behavioral Health Resource Networks. They did this rigorous algorithm to figure out the percentages that each county would be eligible for. So, maybe Multnomah County had X% and Marion County had X%. And what we did, and I will get into this, but, we took that formula, made sure it matched the purposes in the bill to get everyone to their respective floor amounts. It's pretty complicated. Got some really great slides for it. But all of the pieces of pie are identified at the outset. So someone, like, we have one whole pie and, Marion County has one slice of pie. They can get 50% of their slice up front, and it will just remain their 50% later, and that won't affect anyone else's slice of pie that's already been identified. So it's a formula-based calculation that everyone will have at the outset, and that's very important to this conversation today. We have to determine those funding amounts. So that will be the GRC's responsibility to go through and determine exactly how those set out. But once they're set, then we can roll out this application, let people know, hey, it was determined that you're eligible for $150,000. You can get your $75,000 upfront as 50% because you're one of the 23 identified counties. Are you interested? Great. And then, hey, if you want the other $75,000, you're going to have to go through the standard VHD solicitation process and, tell us more what you're going to be doing and go through that whole show. That kind of clarify that a little bit. I know I'm going to get into further details later.
You've included the tribes in that too. Correct?
Yes, yeah. So the tribes, and I'll go into further detail later as well, but there is the counties are affected by this burn percentage. The tribes are not. The tribes, the GRC will be determining the proportion of funding that each tribe is eligible for today.
Today?
Mhm.
We haven't had consultation yet, though.
Right. And we will be initiating consultation. It's that it's kind of like the first impacts thing. We have to determine the set aside amount, then initiate consultation because that will trigger the critical event of this amount is available to you all. What do you want your process to look like in terms of applying for it?
And ideally, we would want to engage in consultation first, but we can't meet our other statutory obligations until we know how much the counties should get. And so certainly when we have the discussion about the tribal set aside, I think that this is something we should figure in, is trying to find that right amount.
So maybe I'll get to this later, and this is kind of the level of detail, but will there be floors for the small counties?
Yes.
And if some of the 13 counties that weren't early adopters don't wind up applying, are you anticipating a supplemental round?
No.
Or what will happen with that money then?
I believe it will go back to the state. This is only through June 30th of 2025, which is only 4 quarters of time.
So, sorry.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of time.
Right.
But yes, we would try to get that money out. I think more of the question is whether, so let's say that 13 counties don't apply, and just to give them a round number, that represents $1 million.
Yeah.
I think the question is whether we then add that to the formula and
Right.
it automatically goes to the ones who
Mhm.
participated, or whether it's a competitive solicitation round like we do for Justice Reinvestment. And we're still exploring
Okay.
that piece. We would certainly never not send any money back, though.
Yeah.
We are trying to figure out what is the best time to really ask a county to opt out, however.
Mhm.
We don't want to force, for example, if you're in the 60-day group, we don't want to force your hand next week to say whether you're in or out, because local conversations have to happen. But I think that when we do finally get towards that full application, we may need at that point to have folks really indicate whether they're in or they're not.
Mhm.
And then we can see how that flows from the process there. But we've been debating at what point. I know there are some folks or some counties that are not on the 23 list that are certainly going to be excited about applying.
Mhm.
And we've heard a little bit of caution, even because that's the other rub with the 23 counties, is that it was not necessarily based on a vote of the full county commission, for example. An interested party who's on the list of necessary partners could have signed. So for example, in one county, the signatory was the district attorney, but the county commission had not considered whether they supported it yet. And so we may actually have some counties in the 23 that say, hey, we're going to wait, or we haven't gone through our process yet. I think a lot of this remains to be seen, and we're trying to talk to our local partners to get a gauge. But I think this has all happened so quickly. Not everybody has everything completely prepared yet, certainly.
Judge Shanti, I see your hands raised.
So you can tell me if we'll discuss this later, or maybe we never will, but I can't get my head around how you're going to determine how much the tribes are going to get, not the individual tribes, but the chunk of money. Because if you're using the 20 million and then using that formula to figure out what the counties have, it would seem that that formula would eat up the 20 million. For the
Right.
counties. So are you backing off some total so that there's some money for the tribes?
Right. The tribal set aside decision will happen first, and that will be discussed later today.
Okay, great.
All right. In terms of data, there's also some new CJC charges. So we are required to establish a data system to track deflection program outcomes, including connections to social services, criminal justice system avoidance. Other relevant data can be pretty broad. But we are working with the Oregon Health and Science University, Portland State University School of Public Health, Waddell Research Group that you all know well, on a project plan to expand the existing REDCap data collection platform that the Impacts High Utilizer programs are already using. So what would it look like to expand that to be available to all of Oregon's 36 counties and all of Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribal governments, as well as to provide technical assistance to counties and tribes to get their data collection program, or not program, but platform and also practice up and running, because we can understand that data collection can be a pretty big lift. So imagine a lot of hand-holding and one-on-one technical assistance with grantees to get that up and going.
It's important to note here that unlike our deflection program, where we have, as a committee, needed to take money from the actual deflection fund, or oh my gosh, see, I'm getting my high utilizer funds, excuse me, to pay for the services of OHSU, the legislature provided us a separate allocation independent of grant funds to support this work.
In terms of data tracking, the CJC is required to track data regarding deflections, arrests, charges, convictions for possession and delivery of controlled substances, including date and location of each deflection event and arrest, the specific offense of arrest, charge, or conviction, demographic data for each person deflected, arrested, charged, or convicted. CJC must also analyze the data to determine whether and to what extent racial disparities exist. This is its own section in House Bill 4002. And analyses will be incorporated into ongoing technical assistance provided to grantees as directed by a budget note in House Bill 5701. On the left here, you'll see a small table. So data type, those arrests, charges, and convictions will be coming from administrative data sources like pre-existing databases maintained by state agencies such as Oregon State Police, OJD, DOC. And then deflections, that will be coming from the grantees. So the ones reported in that REDCap system from the grantees themselves. Dr. Brigham?
Yes, this might not be the time because I know you have more slides,
Yeah.
so feel free to delay. But since you have it laid out with the types of data, arrests, charges, convictions, and then below that deflections, is there some minimum like required criteria? Does there have to be an arrest? Because earlier in the comments, it sounded like a deflection could occur just from an interaction with law enforcement and an individual in the community who might be eligible for arrest, but doesn't then get an arrest. Just a little hard for me right now to get my thinking around, like, what are the minimum requirements of a deflection program? And is there even going to be data in that top row if a county, or can they opt to say, we're going to do these deflections at the point of encounter, but we're just not going to put a system together for arrests or charges or convictions that's related to deflection? Would that be an eligible program? I'm just curious how, what the minimum requirements are.
Yeah, I might defer to Ken on that. He's more data guru with this info.
So I heard a couple different pieces there. I think that certainly for the minimum, we will really be working off of the program description and the eligibility criteria. So certainly there, I would expect that there would be a group of individuals who are encountered, who you're right, they do not get arrested. The only data points we would have on them would be upon their arrival or deflection. Then we have data from them there. We have had some folks bring up some good questions about what if there are services provided in the field, right? And so I think there are going to be some tough nuts we have to crack as to who is responsible for getting data on some of these. And by calling them an edge case, I mean, I think they might be larger groups, but right, like if you have a law enforcement encounter in a lead type program, for example, that does not result in somebody going to a center where they meet with a coordinator, for example, or with a screening or some other type of contact. We're gonna have to figure out how to collect that data, certainly. But I think for some programs, they may refer someone for deflection after an arrest, but before any other action is taken. And so some may fall into that arrest bucket who actually eventually go into the deflection group too. We're talking internally about how to make sure we don't double count those folks. But then more broadly, the data tracking section asks us to track all data on this new drug enforcement misdemeanor, as well as on delivery. And so we will definitely see arrests, charges, convictions. Maybe for some or for many of these programs, maybe those are the folks who have other co-occurring crimes, right? So they did not meet the eligibility criteria for deflection upon their arrest because they are also engaging in a burglary. We would see them in our data to then report on outcomes and numbers for the legislature. Certainly, I don't think we're going to see folks in the dealing category who go into deflection, at least from what I've heard. You know, potential partners, we would see that data too. But I think that the real piece that our researchers are going to be working on pretty closely with OHSU and then also talking through with the programs on the ground is, you're right, how to make sure we're getting all of the folks who are eligible for deflection and the people who are going through deflection. Because I think that's the other eligibility. The eligible one is another tough group, because what if an officer tells you, you know, we need you to go to this center for an assessment within 7 days, and then you don't show up. We need to make sure we have a way to track that too. And so those are some of the pieces we're working on internally, but they're probably the most concerning potential blind spots as we try to build a system. But we have to also see what some of the programs are going to look like first before we think about who needs to collect those different data points. I will mention just very briefly, the responsibility for data collection falls with the coordinator position that should be created in each county. And so there may need to be coordination from the coordinator with external partners to make sure that data is appropriately collected. One other small piece to the puzzle is when the governor signed the bill yesterday, she issued a signing letter that also asked her, very politely asked us at CJC to create a standardized form that all county programs can use. They can then be recognized by the courts or recognized by other entities as this is the I completed deflection. And so I think that can play into it as well. If we're using a standardized form, then that may make it a little bit easier, at least for the successful people being deflected, to track them. But then we have to think of the other groups. Sorry if that was rambly. It's a little bit stream of consciousness, but it's kind of what we're going through. We discuss internally.
So going down that, and I've had a question on this since I've read this, completed the program. Has there been a definition defined as that? Because
it's a local decision.
Okay, because that can be anywhere where you go in for 15-minute assessment, you complete it and move on, compared to no, you have to go through. So that's a local decision, because that is, like you mentioned, that the program coordinator is responsible for taking that data, sending it back to the agencies for all the expungements that they're going to follow afterwards. So that's one thing.
Right to the DA's office, so they know not to file charges.
Right, exactly. So I just didn't know if that definition was going to be set or not.
I think at this juncture, no. I think we need to see what is coming from the counties, and maybe, I'm not sure if you have slides on our other report. There's so much in this bill. So
The best practices.
yeah, so another thing that we were asked to do is within 12 months of the signing of the bill, so 12 months of yesterday, we have to file a report that looks at best practices for deflection. taking a national view and then thinking about how that would work in Oregon. So at that point, we may have some best practices that suggest that this is the appropriate way to do some of the things we've been talking about. 6 months after that, we're supposed to take any data we have from our programs to then suggest possible standards for future legislative action. Because right now it is written very loosely statutorily so that we don't have too much wiggle room to maybe make some requirements that may come as recommendations in that document, but that's where we would need to engage legislatively. Again, I think the intent was to define this very broadly so that we don't stifle innovation, local practices, but then to try to hem things in with what is research supported moving forward. And that would also play into the future funding discussions for the program too.
I definitely see that for the local control and as this went through, one of the stipulations legislators wanted to get out. I'm just a little concerned that completion, if you come up with maybe a best practices definition, I think will be important because it could really skew the data.
Oh, sure. We're gonna have to pay very close attention to that. I mean, we've heard so much of it's anecdotal at this point, but at one point during the legislative discussion, the standard that was discussed was to have a screening, so not even an assessment, but a screening and a contact.
Yeah.
That would be the statewide.
The intention of ballot measure 110.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The legislature backed off of that as being set as a statewide standard, but that means we may see a county that defines their standard as that. We may see a county define it in a much stricter way, but I think part of the goal with the 18-month report, which I'm a little bit worried about the timeline because it takes time for programs to get online. But if we see a county that sets a standard that is so high that no one can complete, I think that's going to be a very relevant point for us to report in the future as we go forward. And so I think you're exactly right that this is going to be a bit of a moving target, but hopefully the data will help us to have that discussion and whether it's through informal means, like our staff going and saying, hi, County X, you're the only one with a 0% completion rate. And we think it's because of your standard. Look at all of your neighbors and what they're doing, or whether it's through more formal means, then hopefully we can get that county to see that perhaps they need to reconceptualize a bit.
Along those same lines, I have concerns about the lack of specificity in this, and I get kind of the local control argument, but at the end of the day, I would think that one of the metrics that we would be looking at is how many people are deflected, how many people are arrested, charged, and convicted. And if we have, 30 counties that are engaged, and some counties have a 25% deflection rate and other counties have an 80% deflection rate, that would be a big concern, I would think, of this committee. And figuring out kind of what is kind of the baseline that we're shooting for here, I think is going to be critical.
And I think something that gives me a little bit of hope that there will be some consistency across the state and that also allows for the counties to have their unique programs, is that form, that deflection form that you were talking about. Because also when you think about what the counties may propose, just I've been in conversation, would like to have a peer be the one, like our law enforcement and peer pilot happening in Portland. And so regardless of the scope of the profession that's doing the deflection program, say peers, it would be out of scope to report on whether or not someone showed up for their deflection. And so it was a form like that, like when you go to the doctor and you get your flu shot, they hand me the tablet, I sign electronically. And so that could solve the problem that the hill I was going to die on. Please do not count peers, because that would be outside of scope. It could be very useful. And also, how do you reconcile that we're not going to be many compliance officers either?
Well, the two reports that Ken was mentioning are up on the screen now. So 12 months from yesterday is April 1st of next year. And then 6 months beyond that is October 1st of 2025. That first one is the study to determine the best practices for deflection programs and make recommendations for funding. And then that second one will be to develop standards and best practices for deflection programs based on that data that was collected. The last slide I have for you all before our 10-minute break is just more reports to the legislature that will be due. So August 31st, 2025, so next year, and then annually thereafter. There'll be an analysis of administrative data for patterns of disparity in deflections, arrests, charges, and convictions for possession and delivery of controlled substances. And then September 30th, 2025, and then annually. There are now going to be combining impacts reports. So the existing report that we have that's due January 1st of every year, we still have that due January 1st, 2025. So those get a double whammy of impacts high utilizer information next year. But September 30th, we will be combining that outcome measures, evaluation metrics for the original high utilizer impacts grant, as well as monitoring the progress of and evaluating outcomes for the new behavioral health deflection program. So if there's any questions on reports, I think now it would be a great time for a 10-minute break. I do want to be mindful of our action items that remain. So please be back here at 1:45 p.m.
Yes.
You
Yeah. Believe me, one thing that I can thank God, I started working here 3 years ago.
Yeah, he's very welcome.
I know. It's in that room.
No, I should, I
I know.
have a sweet.
Absolutely.
Oh, there's food in that room.
And I'm so.
You want some of mine? Because I didn't know. Yes, no, please. Okay.
I do have a hard
I
time.
didn't have one, so it's.
Yeah, I know, I grabbed a cheese stick on the way out. So,
All right, folks, we are back off mute, just as everyone's aware. Hopefully. All right, welcome back. Moving forward along in the agenda, we are going to be discussing the implementation plan, which are those timelines that I was alluding to. And then we will be getting into the formula funding table review, discussion, decisions, and then followed by the maintenance funding discussion and decisions. We are set to conclude this meeting at 3 p.m. So I just want to make everyone mindful of that time in terms of discussion. There's those two very important action items that we must get through today. So in terms of the implementation plan, I want to visually orient you to how these timelines compare to one another. So on the top here in yellow is the early adopter timeline for the behavioral health deflection program. And the bottom timeline in blue is the standard BHD program. You'll see that the timeline starts on the left in April and then goes through the end of September. This is just a visual orientation. I have much more detailed timelines to share with you on both of these, but you'll see that there is a little bit of overlap. However, like the review and decision, so a decision would happen before the contracting period would begin for the early adopter yellow timeline. So decisions would happen by that beginning of May. And a county would know, hey, we opted in for that 50% funding and we got it. And they would be in the contracting process, making sure that they get that money by the end of May, by the beginning of June. And hopefully that would give folks, those early adopters who did opt into that process, some time to also consider if they want to seek the other 50% of their funding as part of the larger standard BHD timeline on the bottom there. The standard timeline is a bit more spread out because it is a bit more intense. And, we have a lot more details that we were requiring of people as part of the normal solicitation. So the RGP application, is open for 6 weeks instead of, I think we're doing 2. I can't remember off the top of my head. Well, I'll get to it, but like it's open for quite a long more time, more standard, like 45-ish days that we do for other CJC grant processes. We've got time built in for CJC staff eligibility review, making a nice clean package for you all to then review. It will be a different amount of work that you might be accustomed to, because again, this is not a competitive process. You're not going to be comparing grant, applicants against each other, but rather reviewing their plan and their eligibility to see if, yes, they meet the threshold to begin deflection. So hopefully that will streamline part of the review and decision process, because I realize I was talking to Dr. Stanfield earlier and we were doing the math, 36 counties plus 9 federally recognized tribal governments is 45 potential applicants. That's a lot to review, but hopefully it will be a little bit more streamlined. As part of our standard timeline on the bottom there, we will be moving forward with our internal policy of the protest period. So should someone, not get the award they want or not agree with the decision that you all come to, they have 14 business days to make it known to the CJC, which could, open up further discussion. But then once that protest period concludes, and if no protests were received, we'd go into contracting and getting that money out to those applicants by the end of September. So zooming in on that top yellow early adopter timeline, looks like this. April 1st, yesterday, House Bill 5204 was signed. We're calling that day 0. And as a reminder, we now have 60 days to get money out the door to any applicant of those 23 identified counties. You're meeting today, that's the next thing, and finalizing the tribal set aside, the evaluation set aside, and formula funding table. So we'll get into that as the next action item. Next week, on the 9th, the short form application opens. It's kind of what I was talking about earlier, very high level. And you know, what are they planning to do? Who's involved, who's on board? Maybe a 2-page document, very short. They will have 2 weeks to get that back to us. Short form application will close on April 23rd. We will be offering a webinar to walk counties through you know, that process, answer any questions they have shortly after it opens, but closes on the 23rd. Our staff review begins the very next day, April 24th. We are going to basically, as we review things internally, as soon as it's good to go, get that contracting process started. But all contracts should be sent for signature by no later than May 1st, I believe. Maybe, I'm pretty sure that's the right date. I'm so sorry. I realize I may have my notes wrong here. But then they will have 3 weeks, counties, and of the 23 identified counties, to get us back to those signed contracts, to get them over to Ken to sign, and then hand over to the Department of Administrative Services to then begin their money disbursement process. The CJC does not handle the actual funding. That is DAS who does that for us. But we built that into this timeline to hand the contracts over to them, have them begin to, you know, processing that to then get money out, hopefully by May 29th, as the 60-day timeline comes to an end on May 31st. Are there any questions about this implementation, like, plan of action for the early adopters? Right, then we're going to be zooming into the bottom blue timeline. And so this gets extended quite a bit. You'll see that on the far left is April 1st, and on the far right is the end of September. So House Bill 5204, there's an error on that, sorry. 5204 was signed yesterday. The request for grant proposals, we're shooting to open on May 20th, and that will be open for 6 weeks' time. That would close July 1st. CJC staff would do our review of eligibility, making sure that, you know, if someone forgot to include a part, that we, you know, work with them to get that information, or maybe something was unclear. We'll then create some sort of easy to review packet. You know, picturing maybe a handy cover sheet of, hey, CJC reviewed this and we found it checked all the boxes. Then we'll hand that over to you, you know, GRC members for your review. It's going to be a tight turnaround of 2 weeks for your review. But as a reminder, not a competitive grant. These are not competing against each other. It's really just did they do the things we asked them to do? Did they check the boxes? Do you have any concerns, questions, etc.? We'll be scheduling a grant review committee meeting for the week of July 29th. With award decisions due by that Friday of that week, so August 2nd. We will need decisions made by August 2nd, so that on August 5th, which is that following Monday, we can send the notices out. That protest period, if you remember, the 14 business days commences. Folks have an opportunity to weigh in should they not just agree with the decision that was made. Protest period would end on August 23rd. August 26th, we would send all of the contracts out to grantees for signature. Try to give them a little bit more time, 4 weeks for that process. We recognize that each local jurisdiction has very different contracting processes. They may need to get their whole lipstick involved. They may just have the county commissioner sign it. You know, it differs from county to county. So 4 weeks for them to complete their process, with the note that on September 1st, the new law takes effect. So that's when things officially are recriminalized. And then September 23rd, we'd get all those signed contracts due, get them over to DAS for that processing, money out by September 30th. And as a reminder that although this process is occurring in over May, June, July, August, September, the folks who are doing these operational or planning grants could ask for eligible expenses to be backdated to July 1st. So, even if they're getting their money in September, they could be like, hey, we've been working on this. We've had these people on board. So some of our eligible expenses started at the beginning of the project period, July 1st. Dr. Brigham?
So it seems like the grant review part of this is to see if the application just meets the minimum requirements. It's not going to be really a qualitative kind of review, and it's not competitive. So that strikes me that maybe not every application needs to be reviewed by every grant committee member. When we did the original grants, we all read every grant, scored every grant, discussed every grant, but I'm not sure I see the value to that process if really all we're doing is just checking to make sure they actually meet the minimum requirements. And then the funding is a formula, so there's no determination there once we've done this other parts. Just a thought.
Yeah, I would leave that up to you all to decide if that's something you want to do. I think that sounds like a great distribution of work. It's also something that we don't have to decide at this moment. In terms of prep work that I think might help, I could, picture getting an informational meeting together with you all. We're not making any decisions that day. We're kind of talking through process, figuring out how we want to tackle it. Just a quick virtual thing to be like, hey, here's what I'm thinking. What are you thinking? And so I could picture that being really helpful, maybe at the middle of this process before it closes, perhaps, for those July holidays. Yeah, Janie.
And so maybe to that effect, then we don't have to worry about conflict of interest in the way that
We
we
could divvy it
did
up,
when it
yeah.
was competitive. But if they're distributed, we could also not be a part of accounting. Reviewing accounting, we're part of.
And I guess one maybe nuance to it is I think you're right. I think we could think about how to divide them up. Certainly if they're planning grants, maybe they need, a little bit less than a substantive grant. But for the substantive ones, and I think that RJ brought up a good question earlier about, there are at least 5 items on there that are discussed. And so I do think it would be wise for us to review all of those to make sure that we're satisfied at the level that they have planned out those pieces. Certainly for some of the others, do you have a coordinator, yes or no? Maybe staff even parcel out the pieces that are needed for us so we're not looking through 30 extra pages of fluff. But I do think there's probably something on each application for a full program that we should look at.
Yeah.
Unless folks disagree, that's not my decision. That's our decision collectively. But I just would think that certainly if we want to make sure that they're adhering to the spirit of those questions, then we want to have a full review.
Because ultimately, part of this is also after a couple of years with your reporting is then to look at what is best practice, what's working, and seeking funding across broader funding across multiple counties, right?
Mhm.
So I think that initial review and looking at it that from that perspective might be helpful. Sorry, sure.
Oh, that's okay. No, and I was going down the same line that Ken was talking about. I think there's going to be a set of questions probably that are just going to be check the box that we don't need, but there may be some other content in the application that is more subjective that we need to make sure that as a group, we all agree that that met what it was, the goal. And then to add on that, if it doesn't meet it, I think our goal is still to get this money out to all the counties that apply. So could there be like a week that we can say, hey, the committee recommended this, you didn't quite meet the eligibility, so that they can in turn come back with, not just say, nope, you didn't meet it, you're done type thing.
Yes,
Yeah, I think statutorily that would work.
Okay.
I don't think, there's nothing that compels us in the timeline to make the decisions by a certain date. So I think if a county were to not respond to certain substantive questions or to respond, very dissatisfactorily, then we could send it back to them. I think that's one piece that this timeline doesn't quite put into perspective, right? As a committee, we'll need to be kind of prepared for whether it is an unsatisfactory response in an application where we need to maybe send it back, or even at some point, all the planning grants will need to, and I keep calling it being converted. I don't know if that's the right term, but the planning grants will have to be converted into implementing a program. And so and I think one thing we'll want to talk about in the future, I don't know if this is for today, is how do we want to do that? Do we want to have set meetings like we've had in the past to where as a county, if you think you're getting close to ready and you reach out to our staff and you say, oh, our next meeting's in September, then maybe we handle a batch of 5 essentially amendment requests, but that converts the planning grant to a full grant, or is it maybe on a rolling basis? I mean, I think we can figure that out, but I think that even at that first jump, when we are doing this round, we're going to have probably some counties that say thanks, but no thanks. Some counties that say we are so not ready, but we want to be ready eventually. And so they get planning grants. Some that are actually really ready to do something. And so I think we're going to have a bunch of different buckets to kind of look at. It'll be interesting to see how big they are, because then that'll help us to know what our future workload is too, as we try to move from planning to doing.
With most planning, demonstration, implementation grants, there's a threshold for planning, a not to exceed amount or something. And I'm curious, we're putting 50% of the money out there. We're saying this is planning. That's a lot of money for planning. Are there any ceilings around how much can be spent on planning versus implementation?
And I think that when we see the budgets that are coming down in that second round, certainly if a county is entitled to $4 million and they want to have the most Cadillac planning of all time and spend $4 million on it, I think that's the point where we push back and say, no, that's not a good use of funds.
Okay, but there's nothing in statute. There's nothing. Could we establish a threshold?
I think we could by rule. I would have to look at all of the provisions again to make sure that we can do that. It's unfortunate. An earlier iteration of this bill, the planning section actually would have had a sunset on it after, I think, a year. And that did not make it into the final version. And so we'll have to look and see if we can put actual guardrails on it. But I think that the real kind of stick that we have is, again, if they submit a budget, even if this is their formula money that says it's all for planning and we're going to build a beautiful planning room out of gold, then we can say, no, come back to us with a different plan for your planning.
Well, formula funding table is the next action item that we'll be discussing and walking through. So in terms of decisions that are going to be made today regarding the formula funding table, we have determined the proportion of funds available to an applicant that is a tribal government, decide the percentage of available funds to go to evaluation, and then to approve the funding table. In terms of our methodology, again, the actual formula was set for us in statute. It is the Oregon Health Authority's Oversight and Accountability Council's funding formula for those behavioral health resource networks. And what we did is determined the proportion of funds available to the 36 counties using those percentages that were already established. So if they said that, Marion County got 10%, we said, what does 10% look like here? However, in statute, there is a minimum that's established. They call it a floor. The floor for counties is $150,000. No county shall receive less than $150,000. And upon the first pass of those percentages that we got from OHA, It didn't shake out completely. There were folks who didn't meet that 150. So we then lifted the counties who did not meet that floor and pulled funds proportionally from counties who were funded above that floor to then kind of readjust. And just as a aside, this does not include tribes. This is county funds methodology only. We repeated that process until all counties reached at least that $150,000 floor. And some folks still have above that. For funding overview, the
question.
Oh, sorry.
Really quickly, without going into a ton of detail, like when housing does formula funding, we're thinking of things of like severe rent burden and other demographic information. Can you give just a little flavor of what the burn formula is taking into consideration?
Give us one moment to get it pulled up. Okay, so the one that they used looked at Medicaid population, houselessness count, arrests, and drug overdose deaths. So there were basically 4 things weighted, for the 2020 census population for each county. And their fancy algorithm spat out a percentage for each county based on those things. So again, Medicaid population, houselessness count, arrests, and drug overdose deaths.
And can you share the county percentiles?
Yeah, we're gonna get into that. I believe I have. Yeah, okay. Yes, we will. So 20,708,200 is what we're working with. That's what House Bill 5204 appropriated to this program. Of that, there's 3 components. There is the funding available to tribes. There is funding that you may choose to go towards evaluation. And then that there's funding that will go to counties in the way of that formula, depicted by OHA's Oversight and Accountability Council in those percentages through the methodology I just explained. So in terms of funding breakdown, if a tribal floor matched that of counties and it was 150,000 per tribe, then maybe a set aside would look like around 1.3 million. And if this GRC decided to do 3% towards funding evaluation for outcomes, then approximate per county allocations would look something like this. However, the decisions that tribal set aside and that 3%, or not 3%, the evaluation percentage are the things that change these. So those decisions will need to happen first to then figure out how they set. And I'm very lucky to be joined by all these people at my left who have, the Excel workbooks live. And as you adjust things, if you want to look at something a certain way, we can get that to you to then look at, discuss. So they're not all things that we're baked in presenting. We can, be open about it. Can you tell me which slide it is percentages?
Oh, we're working on it. It'll be a few minutes.
Okay. So while we get the actual percentages up, this is just kind of like a geographical map kind of showing that, this is hard to see. You have to recognize your counties in Oregon. But, see the I-5 corridor, generally more populous over in that area, tends to have the most amount of money that would be going if the things set by the GRC in that top right box stood. A more like, I guess, hopefully easier to read breakdown. This is one of 3 slides covering Baker through Grant alphabetically. So there's 2 other slides for the other counties, but this would just go into the specific allocations, again, depending on those 2 things up above. Fernie through Marion here. And Morrow through Yamhill here. You'll see that, there are many counties just at that floor amount. But then for tribes, it will be up to this grant review committee to decide how much proportionally you want to set aside for their opportunity to opt in. And, raising that floor from 150,000, or, we could talk about it as a total set aside, if that's easier, hey, what would 2 million look like, shaken out, or what would this? We were looking during the break at what was the decision from Impact's high utilizer population. That was 20% was the set aside amount that this committee decided for the high utilizers. That was $10 million total, so it ended up being 2 million set aside for the use of tribes. And then the asks for the 2020 round came in a little bit over that, if some of you original members remember. So it ended up being around 21.74% because no cuts were made. But that is what this committee decided previously. If I go back to
Casey,
Yes.
there was a typed question online a minute or 2 ago from Michelle Mason
missed
as
it.
well. I don't want you to get too far beyond
Appreciate that.
what the question was.
Is this funding for 1 year or 2 years?
That is a great point. Thanks so much for the question, Michelle, and I'm so sorry I missed it. This is through June 30th of 2025. This is 1 year funding. So it for the standard BHD program, the project period would be July 1st of this year, 2024, through June 30th of next year, 2025. For those early adopters, they could, they're accessing their money earlier. Their project periods start in April as of yesterday. So if they had eligible funds back to yesterday, they could go. So that's April 1st, 2024 through June 30th of 2025.
Casey, can you speak to the intent for 25, 27 in the legislature? Is this going to be doubled?
Getting can.
TBD. So the direction that we have been given from our funders is to award this initial round of money and to put in a placeholder policy option package in our budget requests for the deflection program. The intent is to continue funding for the program, but I think there's been an acknowledgement that they don't know how much money we'll need. And so for us to be working closely with the fiscal office and with legislative leadership on what the actual cost is appearing to be to continue. We've been asked to conceptualize this program by asking the question, what do we need to get through 25, 27, starting from today? And so this is an initial down payment. Then we'll communicate to them what we need. Doesn't mean we'll get it all, but I think that we need to come up with the best estimate we can as we go through that process. And so we've been given reasonable assurances. I think it's reasonable as you can get legislatively for a session that's not happened yet, but this is presumed to be continuing. But like I said, we don't know how much we really need. And I think as we've gone through just this list now, we see how many counties are at that minimum level. And that minimum level is pretty minimum. And so I think that it's going to be interesting to see what those counties really need to get it going.
To your earlier question, Paul, this is the initial county percentiles. And the reason we didn't have this in the presentation at first is because these all will change depending on not only like the evaluation percentage and the tribal set aside, but then the methodology to bring folks back up to the floors, then change respective percentages. Like if we have to take some from all the proportionate counties that are over the floor, that will decrease their percentages to raise the other folks.
So does this include the tribes at the $150,000 level, or this doesn't include any of the funding for the
Yeah,
tribes?
what you're seeing on this slide are the percentages given to us by the OHA, OAC. This was their methodology using the 4 things that Liz asked about.
Jeremiah.
Yeah, and then RJ. Okay, Jeremiah.
I'm just curious, were the tribes asked the same way counties were, whether or not they wanted to commit early to the process? And if not, do we have any sense to level of engagement?
All the tribes are receiving Burns funds. They are receiving those. And they're pretty excited about the idea to be able to build and work with their local law enforcement as well as their own police force, their own courts, their own social services. So pretty excited about it.
So I think if we started off with having that tribal set aside at 20%, the same way that we did with the impacts, how would the funding look for the rest of the counties? Do you have like a calculator that you just plug that in and it'll in real time show up?
Yeah, and her name is Hannah. She's sitting right here. It does take a couple minutes for us to make these adjustments, get them back onto the presentation and make them live. But we can definitely get that if a 20% set aside were to happen for the tribes, that would be, gosh, I mean, my math is saying a little over 4 million.
Well, I took out, what was it? Took out some of the funding that I think it was, I don't remember what I took. But, so I was assuming that some of this funding would be allocated towards, like technical service. Is that not, is none of this funding staying with CJC for technical service the same way?
I mentioned earlier that we made a separate ask through the legislative process, so we do not need to worry about technical assistance or the data rollout with our grant funds. I will mention that the money that was provided to us was not so much for evaluation as it was for this technical assistance and the data rollout piece. So when we do think of the up to 3% that we can select for evaluation funding, those would be different things. So I don't want to lead you to believe that that's rolled into one. What we received funding for was for OHSU to work on data system rollout, data system technical assistance, best practices, research and technical assistance. Those are the types of things that we were able to get separated from the grant. And it's money given to CJC, but then we can just contract directly with OHSU, which is the plan that we told the legislature when we made that request.
Awesome. Well, I'll let Hannah do her job.
Say more about the 3% then, Ken. This isn't like JRI 3%. This is 3% for the CJC to do evaluations.
We have a 3% provision in the original impact statute. And so modeled that JRI.
Where the counties can opt in.
Right,
To
but
use the 3%.
What we have done is we have kept the 3% back at CJC. And what we've done in the past with that money for our high utilizer impacts is work with OHSU, that Waddell Research Group that does the REDCap data system. But then we've also worked with the Center for Health Systems effectively to do a statewide evaluation of impacts, comparing counties that receive impacts funding with counties that don't. So it's similar, not quite identical to how we do the JRI portion. Not sure if I'm answering your question.
Well, I guess I'm still, if you've already got money set aside separately.
Right, but they're for discrete tasks that are not necessarily evaluation. That's the issue.
Okay.
In the bill, it says the committee may allocate up to 3% of program funds to support grantee data collection and analysis or evaluation of outcome measures. Judge Shanti, your hands up.
Yeah, two things. The first is, if I heard correctly, the tribes have had the Burns formula applied to them. Is that correct?
Do not know that, but Dr. Stanfill did speak to that, yes.
So if that's happened already, could we find out what percentage they each, I mean, why can't we add them into this calculation so we can at least have some educated information about what criteria? I mean, back when we started this, we just picked 20% because we didn't know anything. So I feel like just setting the floor at 150,000, if that Burns formula had some of the tribes much higher than that, that doesn't seem like that would be fair. At the same time, just to pick a number out of the blue without any data at all also seems kind of unsatisfactory. So that's one thing. And then the second thing, I can't remember now what the second thing was, but if we could talk about the first one, maybe then I'll think of the second one. It had to do with the last comment.
Yeah, your concerns are heard. The formula funding for Burns set up through tribal governments is not information that we have. So I do not have those percentages.
It's not public information, then we can't get it.
I mean, we are very lucky to be partners with OHA, and I'm sure that they would be able to share it with us. What's that?
You know, if any of them rise above the funding floor of 150,000, just like the smaller counties?
Yeah, I do not have the information.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. And then my second thing that it just popped back into my head is this stuff about the set aside for the evaluations. So it's discretionary, but it's mandatory that we do it, that we have evaluations and have the data to do the reports. So even though they say we could set aside up to so much amount, we can't not set aside, because then we would have no way to do the things that the statute says we must do. Is that correct?
Yes.
I would say partially. I mean, we at CJC received funding for an additional researcher to help with this work. That person probably will not be physically here for at least 6 to 8 months. But I think that if we were interested in doing the types of evaluations that we're doing currently for high utilizer impacts, then it might be beneficial to set aside some funding for that. That's something that we do not have internally at the agency at the moment. Like I mentioned, we have funding for technical assistance for the data rollout and collection, and we do have a researcher position, but that's what we have received for the grant internally at CJC.
So what do you think a reasonable amount of money would be?
I mean, I think that around this 3% level of 621, that seems about right. I think we could maybe go maybe a percentage point lower. I think that having at least 350 to 400 at the very least would be, that's about the going rate for a lot of this work. But we would be talking about large amounts of money from a difference standpoint.
Yeah, I'm just thinking year one, how much is there going to be to evaluate in the short time frame?
And that's a good point too, is we may not have as much to evaluate right at the beginning, and we might want to revisit that for any future round. I know Liz raised her hand a while ago.
Just a quick question. Was using the Burns formula part of the legislative language? It was. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. This may be for you, Sharon. Were there specific tribal burns, or were they participating in burns?
A little of both. Some are participating with their community partners, others are actually creating their own.
And do you know if they if they then applied within the county's allocation of funds, or if they had a separate allocation per tribe.
We have a separate.
Separate, okay, so there is some formula that exists.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty low. Maybe 4%, 5%. It's pretty low because I think we weren't included in the beginning and we were afterthought, so we had to go back and I think that's what they finally had, what they could give us because we weren't considered at the front end.
We had some helpful CGUC staff online send over something that was released from the Oregon Health Authority. Their tribal set aside looked like it was about 4.25%.
Between 4 and 5, yeah.
Thank
But
you,
again,
Ian.
that was an afterthought, so that was the problem there.
Mhm.
Sounds like that might have been a little bit of what happened here too, if we weren't included.
The screen now reflects what would it look like for 20% to be set aside for tribes. So on the top right there, you'll see that that would be around $460,000 for the floor. No tribe would receive less than that. The total set aside would be just over 4 million. That middle number in the top left there, 4.14.
And you take out the 150, right? Because if you put a set aside, you wouldn't have a floor amount. I mean, you wouldn't have the 150 in addition. That'd be subtracted.
The floor becomes 460.
So no,
That's not including the 150. Now you're saying everybody got 150 to start. You would not include 150 for the tribes.
right, because we rose them. So including the 150, there'd be more, $300,000 more.
That's not how we did impacts, right? We didn't give a floor and additional 20%. We only gave 20%.
Right, so that's, okay, I see what you're saying. So this is two different ways to look at that. The 20% amount is the 4.14 million.
Okay.
And then just for speak, I guess, in terms of looking at what that would be per tribe, we can forget the floor amount, but per tribe, if all 9 tribes were to opt in and be like, heck yeah, we're game. That would be 460,000 and change per tribe.
I think maybe where a tiny bit of confusion is coming in is the only statutory requirement is that it says explicit it can receive less than 150. So I think we've been thinking about it from the concept of a floor. However, if we did a 20% set aside, it also says that the GRC can decide the portion available to tribes. And so we could think of it as in each tribe gets an equal share, therefore 460, 182 per tribe. I think that we probably could take it as a competitive if we wanted to. I think we have much more flexibility in the statute as written for tribes than we do for the others. So we don't have to presuppose that there is a floor.
Yeah, we could ask the tribes.
There's only a floor if we only want to give 150 per tribe.
And this is where consultation would need to come in at that point. Okay.
Yeah, as soon as we, because it's kind of like the chicken and egg situation, because the set aside needed to be decided today, as soon as we have that dollar amount, that's when we wanted to initiate consultation to say, hey, otherwise, we would have loved to have started consultation way earlier. I'm sorry, Paul, I cut you off.
No, I was just gonna say we need to make the decision today, and I'm looking at some of these counties and I really don't have a basis for, making this decision. If we set the floor at 20% and that's 460, that's more than like a Yamhill or a Klamath or a Lynn County would receive, which are kind of, medium-sized counties. And how do they compare to the tribes in terms of population, numbers? It's hard to say this is the right number without having a little more information.
I hear you. I agree. Judge Shanti, your hand's raised?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so, like I said, we came up with the 20% for the tribes originally, I think because we wanted to make sure that the tribes had enough money to do something, and it was this feeling of like, we don't want them to feel tacked on, which I think this conciliation process in some ways always feels that way because you can't start it until you've got the money, and you don't know how much money until you've done it. So I don't know, it's not very helpful, I don't think. But if they did the Burns thing and it was 4.25, but it sounds like, I don't understand. It was tacked on, so maybe there wasn't the total amount of money or something. So 4.25 would put every tribe at 460 if you divided it evenly. Now my memory, and I could have this totally wrong, but is when we did the impacts grants, some tribes both needed more and also were more interested or more capable, or I don't know what the reason was, but it wasn't even Steven across the board that we gave each tribe X amount of money. And if I remember right, some tribes used their money and then some tribes it took them a while to figure out what to do. So I don't know that we want to treat every tribe the same, because if the analogy was the counties, we'd be like, Multnomah County gets, you know, X and Yamhill County gets Y, even though the Burns thing didn't. I guess what I'm saying is we're not giving each same amounts to each county. So I don't know that we have to give us the same amount to each tribe either. But
Yeah, thank you, Judge Shanti.
But we're
I think-
looking at, you're saying that the 4.25 set aside would translate out to this 460 for each tribe.
No, that's not correct. Sorry.
Oh, no. What would it translate
So-
out for tribal?
What you're seeing here is 20%. So
Oh,
the
20.
circle on the left,
Yeah,
20%
all right.
of all available funds translates to 460. And what might be better to think about is the set aside amount total. So 20% is a little over 4 million, rather than what, like you said, maybe we don't need to talk about which each tribe gets, but rather the pot that is available to tribes.
All right, so but if we did the 4.25%, that would be, what would that be? Way low. That wouldn't even be the 150.
It would be lower than 150. Yeah, so it would be lower than 1.3. What we first proposed that we saw on the screen was around 7% of total funding.
Okay. Based on what we know about what's occurred with the impacts grant that we've already done, do people have a sense of how the tribes have been working with the money that they've been given? Like, does it seem short, or does it seem more, or it's really hard to try to figure out just ad hoc, just decide with no data what we should set aside for them.
I hear your concerns, and I agree that it's difficult. I don't think that we can compare the high utilizer like funding and programming to the deflection programming, just because we're not sure what deflection will look like to stand up. What I can speak to is that 5 of Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribal governments are high utilizer impacts funded grantees. There were 4 tribes, that decided it wasn't for them at that time. So just like the counties, it's possible that maybe there would be a tribe that's not interested. But I can't speak to, projections, just because I really don't know. Dr. Brigham?
Just wanted to point out one from my own thinking. When we were doing the original 20% set aside, we weren't under any mandate to fund the whole state or all the counties. From there, we went to a competitive application process, and made awards until the money was gone.
Yes.
And now we have a mandate to make accessible to all counties a minimum of 150,000. So I just don't think we can use what we did before. This is too different.
Yeah, I think that understanding is correct.
Plus,
Yeah,
not to interrupt you, but the goal for this is very strategic and set by statute, compared to impacts, where it was really looking for what's a good project out there so that we can piggyback that off with other counties. We were really looking for exploratory type projects. And so, you know, maybe a county that, even a small county, say, had this big project that that they want a lot of money to see if they get it going, and that would, other counties could piggyback off later. With this funding, it's so set that I think we need to make sure that the funding is out there for counties and tribes to accomplish the goals in the legislation.
Yeah, I agree. So Judge Shanti, I see your hand, but I want to, say we have less than a half hour left to make these decisions.
I'm sorry, I just forgot to take it down.
So again, to kind of bring everyone back to what is required of us just for the formula funding decision today, we still got to talk about the impacts high utilizer funding today as well. So in front of you for this decision is to determine the proportion of funds available to an applicant that's tribal government. We can also adjust that to say, determine the proportion of funds available to tribal applicants. We don't have to say it can be X per tribal applicant. We can say, here is the 2 million, here's the 4 million that is the set aside for tribal applicants. For number 2, deciding the percentage, if any, of available funds that will go to evaluation up to 3%. And then we will work on those calculations to then show you what that looks like for the counties. So if we walk through these, I really do think that the set aside discussion needs to happen first. We looked at 7%, which was, 1.3 million. So 7% of total funding going to tribes, 1.3 million of the 20. We've also looked at 20%, which is around, sorry, it's right here. Oh, it's in the middle there. Sorry, I didn't see it. Which is 4.1 million going to this pot available for tribes. Are there any other ones that are coming to mind that you want to see? Do one of these feel right? RJ?
I got a question. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So because we haven't had this second discussion, which is what happens to the funds if they're not utilized. But if that were the case, then, say we start off at 20%, tribal entities end up using, 3 million, and so there's a leftover of that. Would that funding, and I know it's hard to ask this question because we haven't had that conversation yet, but could that funding potentially go back to another fund that's kind of like the JRI fund, or would that have to stay with the tribes and like they would have to we'd have to set up a system for that because we've already allocated that percentage to the tribal entities?
Yeah, that's up to you all to decide.
I mean, we would want to take into account consultation and what feedback we received from the tribes and make that decision. But yeah, that would be our call.
But we could make that call later and not today.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Again, we want to make sure that through consultation, we understand. I think that there are some other dynamics we'd want to consider when making that
Could
decision.
we see a 10%?
Yeah,
How
Judge
that would
Shanti.
affect the whole scheme, 10%?
Yes, we can start working on that. Maybe, oh yeah, Dr. Brigham.
I just wanted to summarize, so if I'm understanding it, you showed us a 7% and what the effect here. Going with the 20% really pushes a lot of counties down to the 150 minimum and a lot of the larger counties into fairly small amounts. So it doesn't seem to me that 20% is going to be a reasonable kind of outcome. The formula, if I'm understanding it, the burn formula was 4-point-something%, which is too small in terms of it's less than the amount we needed to get everyone to 150, right? So was 7% was the minimum? Was that the minimum amount that was set aside for tribes to get to the point where everyone got at least 150?
Yeah, 7% was like, hey, if every tribe also got 150,000, that would be 1.3. And so that's what that first one.
So we're already, we know what that number is, what the minimum is to meet the requirement of it. No one getting less than 150.
Yep.
And it's 7% is how it works out in the budget. So we're already a good bit above what the formula was for the burn. So, I mean, we can look at these other ones. I'm just not sure what criteria we use to determine, what's right or fair, but.
Yeah, from your discussion.
Between 7%, and it's 7% up.
From your discussion points earlier, though, it might be worth reminding folks that the 150, the 7%, which would be 1.3 million, you know, if, unless it was treated competitively among tribes, which maybe that would be something that they would be interested in doing, that wouldn't leave a lot of room for over 150, should a tribe need more than 150,000. But again, without having, you know, gone through consultation, it's difficult to even begin to guess what tribes might be interested in or, you know, benefit from.
One option that we might think about is to say, okay, we know we have to do at least 7% to get to those minimums. The need and desire for this amongst the tribes may vary. So we could set that aside and then have a process that keeps that money allocated to them, even if some tribes don't apply. So if it ends up being like the high utilizers, and I think it was it 4 or 5 tribes didn't apply, that money remains with the tribes, and that allows for some of them to have well above 150.
Yeah, treating it more like an actual set aside pot of funding that's available to tribes.
That maybe rather than being competitive, it's just based on participation, you know, whether they desire to participate or not.
Well, I mean, I think this comes back to one of the first questions I asked Ken about what happens for the counties that don't apply. And I think we need to make the same decision, don't we, at some point, about whether we just take whatever money is left over and apply that to the formula and just give it to the counties in the same way we could do the same thing to the tribes. If 5 of the tribes apply, we take the remaining dollars and just allocate it to them, or whether we set up a competitive process.
I would want to get the full sign off from DOJ, just to make sure it's not just Ken reading the statute. But the way that I read this, that is slightly different than JRI, is I think we would be compelled to give, or at least to offer to the counties. Again, if we have $1 million left over from any source at the end of our cycle, we would be compelled to give it out according to the formula, or again, to offer it. Again, if other counties want to refuse, then that means everybody gets a little bit more, but that's at least how I read that provision in the statute. And then the reason why I raised my hand is I think, Paul, that your comment on the timeline that we would have to spend evaluation money is very well taken. So I would propose, and I'm sorry, Hannah, because I know you're in the middle of another calculation, I would propose that we set aside $150,000 for evaluation only, which would put about $470 back in the pot for however we distribute it. And I would hope that we could revisit that percentage once we get to a new funding cycle when we have more to evaluate. But that would give us some flexibility to maybe lay some groundwork for future evaluation. And also, I mean, that's the equivalent of several county, at least 2 county grants, more than that to then boost things up. That would be my proposal. And I just have too many lines over her head right now.
What is our process here? You don't need a motion.
Great. No, basically, we need some sort of consensus so I can tell you what you're voting on. It would be nice to have something to look at, be like, hey, this is what you're looking at. This is what we're voting on. So this does not reflect Ken's evaluation change. So we're working on that. But, you know, if it were something like this, I would say, you know, this decision for you is to approve this, which includes the tribal set aside, evaluation funding, and, you know, the funding available to counties via the methodology of the percentages, which we also have a slide on, but this summarizes it at least.
Is it with the 10% to tribes that you want to see the 150 for evaluation?
I would take the 150 off the top, and then 10% to tribes, and then the rest according to the formula. Is at least my initial thoughts.
Helpful.
Unless folks had a different order of operations they proposed.
I think that makes sense. And that would put each of the tribes at like over 200, a little over 200,000. Yeah.
This number is without the evaluation.
Right.
So a little
bit. Yeah. And so I'm assuming that When we come back in 25, we have the ability, once we have more data on kind of utilization, to rejigger, reconfigure these percentages.
There's nothing in the statute that says this is a one-time decision.
Yeah, RJ.
I have another question. So when we read kind of the evaluation on the impact of impacts, I think that there was something that showed that like, tribes and individuals that were associated with tribes, made up a high population of people that were served.
A third.
So I think that that's kind of data right there that says that by investing in tribes, it's turned out well. And we know that like historically, we haven't funded tribal entities. We know that historically, communities of color have been disproportionately impacted by drug possession and addiction and things like that. So I just want to make sure that that's in everybody's mind as we're making this decision.
We're close. Thanks for your patience.
Just to chime in while have a little bit of a void there, I think this is a reasonable approach. I mean, we can look at the adjusted numbers based on the evaluation change, but this gets us up in the 230 plus range as a floor for tribal applicants. And then there could be some in council, it could be decided that there, it's going to be distributed some way different than that amongst the tribes, but it at least sets a reasonable. But I'm curious, Sharon, what you think?
I think it looks good. I think that you will have more tribes participate in this than impacts, of course. But I really do agree that with the work that we did, we really had to dig deep, even for the 5 tribes in impacts, because it was a whole different ballgame than here. But I think this looks good to go to consultation out with the 10%. I think the tribes will appreciate it. And yeah, I think this is a good starting place.
Start over. We just didn't load yet. Okay. Sorry, everyone.
Are we ready for a motion or more discussion?
We're about to put up the new funding amounts, and then we could be ready.
Okay, and no motions necessary. We will continue with voice voting just for the sake of time. So what is in front of you here takes into effect the $150,000 total for evaluation. That shook out to 0.72% of total funding. Then 10% of total funding available to tribes. That total amount is a little over 2 million, so $2,070,819. And that would create the 89% available to counties for, the rigmarole of the funding formula shakedown, which we will be able to show you how that breaks down shortly. Oh, it is ready. What slide is it?
It's 32, but it's you don't have to read.
Oh, okay. Sorry, guys. It is live uploading. So with that in mind, let me just re-upload one more time here to show you what that would look like, how it affects the shares for the counties. 32, you said? Yes, 32. All right. So with 150 for evaluation, that tribal allocation would actually be the 2 million. So sorry, the top of this slide is not accurate. 2,070,819. But what is accurate is the table, the per county allocations. So you're still seeing several counties at that $150,000 floor. Some of the larger, more populous counties looks like, but that's how that would shake out. So I pivot back to this slide, which provides you with the overview. Is there further discussion before going into a vote? I see we still have quorum. Just to confirm that I see some folks online, we're still safely at quorum. Is there further discussion?
This number, right, is this with the evaluation piece reduced?
Yes. So if there's not further discussion,
Yeah, I'm still getting the same number I got before.
Let's double check our math then before we.
yeah,
I wonder if the top line, the 2,070,000 is adjusted.
which one, Dr. Brigham?
The 2,070,000, was that adjusted for the, you
That
know,
is,
valuation money
That's the
being?
10%.
it's 10% of the total funds without regard to
It's not-
valuation.
It
going
didn't
to
change.
Yeah.
Correct.
So
Extra valuation
take
money went to the county.
tribal money out first and then
Correct.
applying the
Right,
3%.
just
Okay.
Because the 10% was already
So no,
established. in the
it's taken,
tribes.
trial.
Yeah. Ready to vote.
Okay. No questions. We'll proceed to the vote.
6 minutes left.
The decision before you now is whether or not you approve this. So as presented on the slide, it would be $150,000 to evaluation, 10% of the total funding. So 10% of 20,708,200, which comes out to $2,070,819 for tribal set aside. We will initiate consultation as part of that process, to figure out how they want to partake in that funding. Leaving $18,487,381, which shook out to be what is on this slide. So the decision for you is to approve this. Are there any abstentions? Oh, and I should also say, this goes through June 30th of 2025, so through the end of this biennium. Okay, all those in favor of approving what you see before you, say aye.
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 Okay, those opposed, please say nay. Right, that passes. And thank you for your consideration and your work on that. I can totally sympathize with how difficult it can be to figure out those numbers as we roll through them. And we've got one last action item ahead of us regarding maintenance funding. So as you may recall, November 2023, this GRC met. They made a decision to allocate and strategically leverage $10 million to move forward with the goal of maintaining existing programs following an evaluation thereof. Then, with any remaining funds of that 10 million, to open a competitive process for capacity building for existing programs. Also at this GRC meeting was the decision to support existing data infrastructure OHSU, but the $10 million pot available to high utilizer impacts for back on high utilizer impacts existing programs. And we have a lot going on right now. So staff recommendation is to proceed with maintenance funding through June 30th of 2025 and delay that evaluation. As of right now, our existing 15 grantees, their project period ends June 30th of this year, 2024. There are at least 5 of those grantees who will be out of money at that time if we don't do something to get them gap funding. So our recommendation here is to approve funding up to a calculated 1-year gap amount for each existing grantee. I'll go through that on the next slide of what that might look like. And then we, CJC staff, will reach out to grantees, ask them if they're interested in opting in for this funding. Just be a very easy yes, no, how much of it do you actually need? Or extend their project period. We also want to, there are several grantees who may not need additional funding at this time and just wish to extend their project period through June 30th of 2025. What this does is, again, kind of gets everyone a little bit more funding so that we as a committee and as staff can have capacity to really go through a performance evaluation thoughtfully, like was intended, We still, have every intention to do that, just delayed by a little bit. We realized we cannot make that decision before June of this year. And it also would be aligning impacts high utilizer program on the biennium line, which almost all of our other CJC grants are on the biennium line. It helps with, legislative funding and advocacy, and would also match with deflection, which would be kind of nice to not have two different grant cycles. So what that would look like in terms of methodology, we basically looked at each grantee, what was their highest award that they got? Because if you recall, some of the original 11 grantees, they didn't really need a lot more money the next round, and we didn't want to penalize them for, that, because most of those programs are now fully operational, up and running, and spending at a much higher rate than they may have been at the beginning. We also didn't, we were looking at the 2-year grant cycle award because that's how we operated for impacts. So if a county maybe got $100,000 for their 2-year highest grant award, maybe that was back in 2020, maybe that was in 2022, we added 10% just as a safe buffer of, we know things have changed, personnel costs, fringe, all that jazz. And then we divided that by 2 to just calculate what's a 1-year gap funding that might get you through June 30th of 2025. And then what I would do is go to this grantee and ask, hey, of this $55,000 that's available to you, how much do you actually need? Maybe they say all of it, and maybe they say, really they'll need $20,000. And then what's left of that would go to a pot of money that we could use for the performance evaluation or capacity building. And we also may be getting more money next session. So it could be one big pot if that's all, a decision you want to make. We don't necessarily have to make that decision today, but in terms of gap funding, this is how it shakes out for the grantees. It's around 6.9 million total. So with the methodology in place, we would basically be going to each grantee, asking them, hey, of this 1-year gap fund recommendation that, was approved, how much do you need? This leaves a little over $3 million available. So that, again, could be part of the performance evaluation of, maybe we combine that with capacity building, or maybe it's like an award of some sort if you're a high performer. We can decide that later. But yeah, our staff recommendation goes back to move forward with maintenance funding, delay performance evaluation for a bit. We could start maybe at the beginning of 2025 to have a decision, by June 30th of next year. But for the time being, get these grantees a safe amount of funding and do it so there's not a lot of burden on them to go through a competitive process to do so. Yeah, Dr. Brigham.
So just assuming, I want to clarify this first. I think it's a reasonable approach. I'm going to suggest I'm ready to approve it, but the reallocation process with just the regular rules exist that we have now for reallocating money in the grant. So there can be a certain amount of that staff can approve. And if it goes above the thresholds, then it would require some review.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing.
Yep. Yep. So the agreement amendment requests, that reallocation request that Dr. Brigham's mentioning, would still be in play should they want to change things around. What we would be asking you to do here is basically do one for everyone at this time, and say like, hey, they could get up to a certain amount.
And I would just mention, I been talking through this with staff. Certainly workload for staff and for us as a committee is one consideration, but 2, we know that there is some overlap, especially for some of our counties, in whether it's facilities that we currently fund through high utilizers, they can be utilized for deflection or vice versa. And so I think that also, for lack of a better term, punting a little bit for our current grantees, letting them continue to do work, we'll have a better idea moving forward how they might leverage those dollars together, or perhaps even maybe some might jump from one to the other. I mean, if nothing else, I think that our 1 year amount for Lincoln County, for example, was higher in the deflection grant than it would be here. And I'm not trying to get our friends from Lincoln County to say anything at this moment, but just to mention that they're doing great work. They're doing a LEAD program. That's a perfect deflection program too. And so maybe there are some strategic ways to use the money together. And so, but I think it'd be nice for us to have a little clarity on that before we make full funding decision for the high utilized folks.
Yeah, Liz.
I heard you making plans, so if folks are saying, yeah, if Douglas County says, yeah, we are not gonna need this $1 million, but if, and I hear you also added the 10% for whatever, but is there a process for one of the grantees coming back and saying, actually, our staffing costs increased by 30% and we actually need a little bit more than this to get us through?
Yeah. Do you have the? One thing that I took into consideration when making these calculations, was looking at their spending rates over the past 2 quarters. And this, needed with that for nearly everyone. So it was giving them like, hey, if you continued spending at the rate that you are, you know, it would be okay. They'd be covered.
And I would assume that if a grantee gave us that feedback, there's nothing to stop staff from bringing that to us and say there's a very special situation in such and such county or with such and such tribe where they have a greater need, then we can consider it at that point.
You're still okay on quorum?
Yeah, barely. If you are joining us online, GRC members, and you need to leave, please let us know. Right now, we do still have quorum, but that would just be really helpful. Thank you so much.
I think this is a reasonable approach.
Does anyone else, oops, I did not mean to go that forward. Do you guys have questions, or is there any other discussion around this approach? Okay, then, if there are no questions or further comments, the decision before you today is whether or not you approve the staff recommendation to move forward with 1 year of recommended gap funding for the 15 existing impacts grantees, the high utilizers, and then to delay a thoughtful performance evaluation or capacity building, plan until a later date so we can get through this deflection rollout. Are there any abstentions?
Do we need to abstain if the 15, one of them affects us, voting on the whole package?
I think that the way that abstentions are treated, if you are personally financially gaining from this decision, so going to your personal bank account or like your spouse's personal bank account, then that would be a reason to abstain. But also if you feel more comfortable abstaining, that will not affect quorum.
I'm Declare as well. I mean, I'm affiliated with Douglas County, so
I'm
really, but I don't personally benefit from these grants, so I think.
If you don't personally financially gain from these grant decisions, I don't believe you need to abstain. But for the record, yeah, you guys, that's totally okay.
You can, and it's fine to state on the record what your perceived conflict could be, even if it's unactual conflict. That's what we've had before. And it's still up to you if you want to vote or actually go through with an abstention.
I was just gonna say I'm gonna abstain. Call abstention.
Recall right now, if any peer programs are funded in Clackamas or Multnomah County through these grants. So I just want to say there might be, but I'll vote.
Okay. Are there any other abstentions?
I'm going to abstain just because it doesn't personally affect me, but the Lincoln County, I mean, the sheriff's office is the one receiving the grant specifically. So I think it's probably best that I stay out of that.
To clarify, I also don't personally.
Same. Right. All those in favor of approving the staff recommendation, please say aye.
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 Thank you. And those opposed say nay. All right, that passes. in terms of next steps, short form application for deflection opens next week. Because we have our set aside, we are initiating tribal consultation ASAP. And we will be reaching out to you all to schedule a GRC meeting to review those deflection things in July for award decisions. So keep your eyes out for that. But are there any questions for me? Yeah.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to compliment the staff on, taking this thing coming down the pike so quickly and being so well organized and
Yes.
helping us get through it. So thank you. You guys are amazing.
It was very impressive how we're able to organize all that. So thank you.
And one super quick question for those in the room. Was it valuable being together today? Should we maybe try to do more hybrid in the future? Okay, yeah, then we'll look in July. Was this a good location for everybody? It's nice to see everybody.
It was nice.
Cool.
Can we have a copy of the presentation as well?
Yes, of course. Yeah, we'll be sending a slide deck out and posting the meeting recording. Yeah, we can get that out. Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here today. Thank you online for joining us. And yeah, we're all set.
Thank you, staff. You guys are wonderful. Thank you so much.
Nice to see you all.
You.